We're starting a series today called Endure. We want to do a relationship series after coming out of January, and we had an idea, and I had an idea, and then this week I felt like God just started kind of moving some things around, and then used some specific people and circumstances to just kind of confirm it and affirm, okay, we need to move in this direction. And so we're gonna talk about relationships over the next few weeks, but through the lens of endurance. When you think of endurance, here's the definition, is the power to withstand a difficult process or situation without giving up. When you think about endurance, you probably think about a race, a marathon that a dozy needs 10K for. That's all right, yep. I don't know what motivation would have to be had for me to run a marathon, but when you think about endurance, you think about it's that thing inside of us that keeps us going. Like that continues to allow us to keep going. There's a writer, we're going to be in the book of Hebrews this morning, and the writer of Hebrews uses the analogy of a race. So if you think about it this way, if you are in a race and your life is a race, what keeps you going? What helps you to keep going? If you think about it this way, thinking about the endurance, thinking about what helps us to keep going, to keep pushing when our legs get tired. And so when our body gets tired, what helps us to keep going? Many of us, if we had to look at a finish line, the finish line for us of to keep going would be satisfaction. Just a sense of personal satisfaction in our life. Like, if I could just keep going and feeling satisfied in my life in whatever way that may be through relationships, that may be through money, that may be through just health, whatever it is. But if I can feel satisfied in life, then I'll keep going. For others of us, it's purpose. If I could just figure out my purpose in life, then I could keep going. And when I do figure out my purpose in life, it is the thing that allows me to keep going. If I get to the end of my life, if I get to the finish line, and I say my life meant something, then it was a life well lived. And so our eyes are fixed on purpose. I got to figure it out. I got to make sure I'm locked in. I got to make sure I'm doing it. Maybe for some of us, it's independence. And here's what I mean by independence. Your whole goal in life is to not have to depend on anyone or anything. I want to be self-sufficient. I want to be strong. I want to be self-made. Whether that's financially, emotionally, relationally, physically, I don't want to lean on anyone. There's probably a lot there of why, but the finish line is this: if I can get to the place where I'm independent, where I'm not leaning on or depending on anyone, then my life will be fulfilled. So what we want to ask today is specifically when it comes to relationships and how we live our relationships and lead our relationships, what keeps us going? So thinking about relationally, the desires inside of us, thinking about sexually, thinking about all of these things that make up intimacy and relationships, year after year, what keeps you, here's a better question, what keeps you from not doing what you want when you want? Like when we think about our relationships, and so we're going to talk about singleness, dating, marriage, parenting. The bigger question is, what inside of me keeps me from doing what I want when I want? Because culture and the mission of culture is just to do what you want, when you want, and however you feel. If you feel it, it's true, go with it. And so the question we have to ask is, what is your finish line? What keeps us going? Because there are times when what you know doesn't quench how you feel. There's times in our life that we feel something and we know it not to be true, but it doesn't pacify and it doesn't quench how we feel or what we feel. And there is this tension that we face to let God and not the body have the final say on how we live. When we think about endurance, there is this tension that every single one of us face. How do we let God and not our bodies, not what I feel, not what I long for, not what I desire? How do we let God have the final say? So I want to ask you again, what keeps you going? You see, the writer in Hebrews says there's this race that we are called to run. It's never going to be easy, and there are people in this room that are so close to quitting just because your body is tired of not getting what it wants. Your feelings are tired of not getting what it feels. Your desires are tired of not getting what they desire. And so you are on the verge of quitting. And I believe God's message to you today is endure. It's to keep going. So the author of Hebrews writes about people who ran with endurance. Hebrews chapter 11, which is where we're going to start. We're going to look at just a few people. This chapter is called the Hall of Faith. We don't know who the author of Hebrews is. There's some people that believe it's one person, it's somebody else. We don't know who the author is, but we do know that he had a good idea of the history of people who have obeyed and followed God. And so he gives us Hebrews 11, this massive chapter that tells us about these stories. I'm just going to pick out 3 of them. Because what he does is he tells us that there's this group of people that he commends them for their faith. However, as he commends them for their faith, he does it with a warning. So Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7. It says this, by faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. So it says, by faith, Noah being warned by God concerning events. So these events are judgment. God comes to Noah and he says, Noah, I'm going to flood the earth. Because of the sin, because of the disobedience, I'm going to flood the earth and I'm going to save and rescue your family. And get this story, right? This picture. He says, Noah, I want you to build a boat. Now, what blows my mind at this point, I got to make sure I don't go too deep in the weeds here, okay? But what blows my mind at this point is humanity had never seen rain before. Literally, the Bible says that water just came from the ground. It had never come from the sky. And so what God says is, Noah, I'm going to make a flood happen. It's going to rain, Noah. And Noah's like, what's rain? He says, just trust me. He says, build this massive ark. And because you build this ark, I'm going to save your family. So what's beautiful is how this even points us to Jesus, right? God provides a vehicle of salvation for the family that trusts him. Like it shows us this is what Jesus was going to be for us. But before Jesus, he says, Noah, I'm going to flood the earth. I'm going to wipe out the earth because of sin, and I'm going to start with you and your family. And so he says, he does it, and he says, I'll never do it again. But can you just imagine, right? So we look at Noah like, man, Noah, what faith? What faith to just build a boat when you didn't even know what rain was? What faith? What faith? But can you imagine the sacrifice also in that? Imagine the ridicule that Noah experienced. Imagine how time after time they'll go by and say, what is this dude doing? Imagine Noah banging a hammer or whatever he had at that point, a mallet or I don't know, a bone from an animal. I don't know what he was using, right? And just looking over and seeing all these people partying and doing whatever they wanted and thinking to himself, that would be so much easier. If we think that Noah wasn't losing something in the process of gaining salvation, we're fooled. Do you think it didn't take endurance, or it took endurance to believe what God was telling him was true when everyone else wasn't concerned with judgment? I mean, don't you think he coveted everyone else's experience in that moment? The author says that he's commended for his faith, but please understand that his faith and his obedience did not come without some sort of sacrifice. He continues to go on, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 11. It says, by faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. So Sarah, God came to Sarah and her husband and said, I'm going to make you a family and a father of great nation. And he's like, I'm going to start with you, Sarah. You're going to have a baby. And Sarah was old, and barren. And so we read this story like, man, that's crazy, right? Like this is a Christmas story before Christmas. Like God was like, you're going to have a baby. And then Sarah and her husband have a baby, and it just happens like that. No, Sarah waited for 25 years. Year after year, decade after decade, waiting. God said it. I want to believe him, and I want to be faithful to him. But it didn't come without sacrifice. I mean, imagine sharing that with someone and enter like the embarrassment of like, why hasn't that happened yet? God said it would. 25 years of waiting. She had to embrace God's complete authority over her body and trust that he will allow it to happen when it's time. And he did, but not without a sacrifice. Hebrews 11:24 is another man that we find by faith. Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater than greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. For he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. So here's what we see. This word, he considered the reproach of Christ. It simply means to be identified with Christ. So he considered being identified with Christ and his people greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. So you got on Moses. God used Moses to rescue the people of Egypt out of captivity, but Moses could have just played by the rules. He could have played by the rules and just experienced everything that the kingdom had to offer. But he said, I consider the reproach to be identified with Christ greater wealth than the treasure of Egypt. For what? He was looking to the reward. So his eyes weren't fixed on what was right in front of him. He saw suffering. He saw what could happen. His eyes weren't fixed on this. He was looking towards a greater reward. And so God used him to rescue the people out of Egypt. It says Moses forsook Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king. Just think about the cost here. It would have been easier and convenient just to submit yourself to the governing powers that control things like marriage, gender, sexuality, just so you could keep your comfort and safety. And Moses said, I see being identified with Christ and even suffering for him greater than the pleasures that this world and this kingdom could offer. You see, the author commends these people. He says, these people of the faith, we look at their stories. Were they perfect? Absolutely not. But were they faithful? Yes. And in that, he says they kept going. They had this endurance, but he doesn't do it without a warning. Here's the warning, that there is a cost for being faithful. There's a cost for being faithful. If you're going to choose endurance, there is a cost. If you have ever endured through anything, you know that there was a cost. There was a sacrifice. There was pain. There was heartache. There was waiting. And the question we have to ask is, what could possibly make someone embrace that cost? What could possibly cause Sarah to say, you know what, I'm just going to hang out here for 25 years until God shows up? What could possibly Moses say, you know what, I'm going to choose to maybe even sacrifice my life to follow what God says? What could possibly cause Noah to suffer all the ridicule, all the loss, all the jealousy, all the maybe anger, everyone pointing fingers, laughing? What could possibly do this? What keeps him going? And the author says this, every one of the people that are commended for their faith, they didn't allow the cost to distract them from the God who loved and obeyed, and they obeyed. And after giving us example after example of men and women of faith, the author shifts the story to us. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1. Here's what he says. So he tells us these stories, these case studies. There's so many more. Read through Hebrews 11. It's so encouraging, but also so challenging. And so he says this, hey, these are the people that are commended. And now I want to invite you into it. I want to invite you into it, what this could look like. And so here's what he says, chapter 12, verse 1. Since therefore, so again, we ask ourselves, if you see the word therefore, you ask, what is it there for? Because we just heard these stories of these faithful men and women. Since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. And so when he says also, there it is, yep. When he says also, he says, let us also. What he's doing, he's pointing back to the witnesses. So he says, so I've told you their stories. They obeyed God. There was a cost and there was a sacrifice, but they obeyed God. So let us also, just like they did, Lay aside every weight. This word weight, it doesn't mean sin. It actually means just what's prominent in our life. What is the most prominent thing in your life? And what the author's saying is it's possible that the most important thing in your life is the thing that is weighing you down the most in running your race. It's possible you've made something more important than the one thing that should be the thing that's most important. So it could be a job, it could be relationships, it could be finances, it could be health. I don't know what it is. But what the author says, he's differentiating between the two things. He's saying that there's a weight, right? There's things that are prominent in our life that we would look at and say it's not necessarily sinful. It's just something in our life. And it could be weighing us down. And then he says, and sin, this simply means to miss the mark. And so there's following Jesus. And when we do things that do not honor God, that go against his word and what he says, that is sin. And so he says there's things in our life that they may be weighing you down. They're just prominent, important things. They're not bad things. They're just not the best thing. But there's also sin that is the bad thing. Seeing those two things combined weigh us down so that we can't run our race. So he says, lay aside those two things. Put them to the side. Cast them down. Because we want to hold closely to him. Then he says, let us run with endurance. There's that word endurance. It simply means constancy. The race that is set before us. Can I just pause here and say that there's a race that is set before us? And if you look to your right or your left, the race that is set before you is a different race than is set before the person to your right or your left. The finish line and the goal is the same, but every race will look different. And I think the problem with Christians is we start comparing our race. What Jesus is saying here is when you're running a race, the worst thing you can do is to look to your left and right and just start comparing. And sometimes we do. At least my race isn't as bad as theirs. Or do you see the race they're running right now? But God says, no, there's a race that is set before you. And you, and you, and you, and you, and you, and you. There's a race that's set before each and every one of us. And so we're called to run that race. We don't look to our left and our right. We look ahead. What does he say, verse 2? Looking to, not your neighbor, not your opponent, not your enemy, not your best friend. Looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So what does the author say? Hey, the goal here, if I had to invite you into actually living this life of endurance out, is to look at what's weighing you down. So things that aren't necessarily bad things, but aren't the best thing, and then also sin, to look at your life and realize that in order to run the best way you possibly can, you got to lay those things down, and then you just fix your eyes on Jesus. Stop looking to culture. Stop looking to your friends and saying, what should I do here? No, he's saying, fix your eyes on Jesus and run that race and listen to what he says. So what I asked you at the beginning, what helps you? What helps you to keep going? And the author says you're asking the wrong question. The question we should be asking is, who helps you to keep going? It's not what. It's not satisfaction or purpose. He says the only thing that can help us to keep going is Jesus. However you have been running, if you are doing it with your focus on everything else but God, you won't finish. And temptation's attack and its strategy is very clear when it comes to endurance. Temptation says, hey, the best way to endure sin is just to sin. The best way to endure it is just to do it. Don't fight it. And so what happens when we have sexual frustration in our marriage? We turn to adultery or pornography to pacify the disappointment or rejection. We turn to inappropriate friendships to cope with our loneliness because the presence of this person brings us identity or peace, so much so that we will call them and seek them out instead of seeking God. We turn to alcohol or an addiction. We even turn to social media, whatever will be a numbing agent for our exhausted lives. And whatever it is, this race will never be easy, but the weight and sin and hindrances are making you run your race more difficult. Some of us have been running that way for so long you aren't even running anymore. So when my kids were younger, they don't do this anymore. When my kids were younger, and they played sports, they'd go out, I mean, this is like 6, 7, 8 years old, and they would go out and they would play, and be playing soccer, and I'd be yelling at them, you gotta run, you gotta run, you gotta run. And after the game, they're like, well, yelling at me, I'm running. And so finally I did what every good dad does. I videotaped the game. And, I said, hey, let's look at it. And each time I pulled it up and I showed my kids, and I was like, you're not running here. And they were like, huh. I guess I could run harder, right? I mean, they thought, like, it feels like, man, I'm pushing it, right? I'm booking it. Praise the Lord, they don't do this. They bust it, right? But they feel like I'm booking it, I'm going, and then you actually see playback, and it's maybe a jog. Here's my fear with many of our lives. We feel like we've been running our race with endurance, and you've barely just been jogging because you've allowed sin and hindrances to weigh you down. And it's felt like a run, but don't get it twisted, okay? Please don't get this mixed up. Don't get it twisted. Don't get this mixed up. Running with endurance and exhaustion from sin are two separate things. Running your race with endurance, what it says here, the author says in verse 2, it turns into joy. Exhaustion from running with being buried down with sin and things that are caused and holding us down, that doesn't lead to joy. It just leads to guilt and shame and more exhaustion. The author says that I'm not saying that your life will be easy, but it will produce joy. So he says there's a difference between running your race with endurance. And here's the difference. He says the only way to run well is to look at God often. The only way to run well is to look at God often. What does he say? He says, run the race with endurance, fixing your eyes on Jesus. So he asked this question, how does this apply to relationships? Everything. Because when obedience leaves you with unfulfilled longings year after year, so we have these things inside of us, these sexual desires, these relational desires, and they leave us and they're unfulfilled year after year, and I'm following in obedience, you begin just to grow weary. And some of you are here today and you're weary. For some, it's singleness, and others, it's marriage, but both, they come with a cost. Because you cannot separate unfulfilled longings and cost. They're actually supposed to be together. And so the question I want to ask, and I want to talk to just 3 specific groups of people this morning, and next week we're talking about parenting, and the following week, marriage. But the question I want to ask each week is this, because what the author is saying is this, is whatever you feel like you're up against right now, run with endurance. And here's why he's saying this. He's saying because Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, is worth it. That no matter how hard or how great the cost is, Jesus is worth it. And so my question is this. If Jesus is worth it, what does endurance look like for you right now? So let's just get super practical. If you're dating, that's cool. Glad you're dating. But the Bible is clear in multiple places, beginning in Genesis, that sex is reserved for a man and a woman in the context of marriage. And outside of that, everything else is sin. So my question to you again is, if Jesus is worth it, then what does endurance look like for you? This isn't about guilt. This is simply asking a question. If Jesus is worth it, what does endurance look like for you? For some of you, you're dating, and you got to stop having sex. Others of you, you're dating and you're living together. And that's leading to all kinds of things. And you got to move out. That's if Jesus is worth it. I can't make you do that, and I never would. But if Jesus is worth it, what does endurance look like? And I know the argument, I've heard it so many times. You understand, it's just easier. Like, it's just easier this way if we live together, but we're not married yet. And I mean, that way we can test the car before we buy it. All those, yeah. It's just easier. It's easier financially. It's easier with insurance. And I've heard all that stuff. And on paper, I get it. I'm like, yep. But here's my only pushback to this. Before you even get married, you are adopting a mindset of easy. It's easier. It's just easy. Like, I feel this, and so it's just easier to let it out and us to have sex together. It's easier. It's easier. Well, here's the problem. At some point, maybe you do get married, but you've already been living with easy. And the thing that the writer of Hebrews is saying is easy and following Jesus just don't line up. There's a cost to obedience. And so what he's saying is this, is if you invite that into your relationship now, it's just easier. Well, 3 years from now, guess what? You're not going to feel like you want to be married. And all the married people in the room can say, amen. It's a little, yeah. That's some fun conversations on the ride home. But again, like, how do we not just give into what we feel? There's going to be times when you feel like, I don't want to be married. And guess what? If you've been doing easy from the beginning, well, guess what's easier now? Just get a divorce. Why don't we just do that? Parenting, we'll talk about this. Like, parenting, you invite easy into your life from the beginning. Parenting, it ain't easy. I'm learning that. It's just a question. I can't make you do anything. I don't want to. But if Jesus is worth it, what does endurance look like for you? Same-sex relationships. The Bible is clear multiple times, New Testament and Old Testament, that wherever same-sex relationships are talked about, it's sin. If Jesus is worth it, what does endurance look like for you? And I know this is where this is difficult, because I've had conversations with people who I love, and they have asked me the question, are you telling me that I'm going to feel this for the rest of my life and have to live with it? And that is a hard question to answer. But what I do know is, like every other feeling and longing inside of me, if it doesn't line up with this, I have to ask my question. If Jesus is worth it, then what does endurance look like for me? And it may be a life of singleness. I don't know. I've seen God do greater miracles. But I do know if he says it, then I'm called to it, and there will be a cost. But then on the other side of that cost is joy, because I'm not exhausted from living in sin. I'm running with endurance the race set before me. Which brings me to the last group of people. If you're single, if Jesus is worth it, what does endurance look like for you? And can I just say this as a church? I just don't mean like our church. I just mean like the church in general. I'm sorry. We have just created this culture that if you're single, you're less than. And that's so busted. It's so busted. And some of us, like, you know, like, it is hard. Like, you walk in the church and people are just kind of eyeing you. You walk in by yourself and like, I wonder if, like, some of you don't serve on a ministry team because you believe that there's a ministry team called the matchmaker team. And you're just like, I have this spiritual gift. I have this spiritual gift. And so what do? We find a single person, and they're like our personal mission to get them married. Made them meet someone. So listen, like, we find like Julie over here, and like, hey, Julie, you know, I heard you singing in church the other day. I was sitting with you, and I heard you singing. It was great. It's great. I want you to meet Bill. He plays the guitar. And I just thought you guys could go out. I think you both like coffee. You could go out and just sing songs to Jesus. So I just wanted to do this, and I'm just going to back up. And we're talking to our friends like, you know. I mean, we laugh, but some of us have done that. And if you're single, you felt that, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Singleness may be the most important time in your life. And I'm not saying you will be called to be single for the rest of your life, but I'm also not saying that you won't. The space, it's a space where you are not responsible for anyone else. And so I just want you to hear this from me. You can be single and be complete in Jesus. You can be single and be complete in Jesus. Here's what Paul says, 1 Corinthians 7:7. I wish that all were as myself I am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. So what does Paul say? Paul says singleness is a gift. He says it's a gift. So can I just tell you right now, you can be single and be complete in Jesus. And so my encouragement to you today is don't waste one gift by envying another one. Don't waste the gift that God has given you. Or maybe you're dating, and maybe in a relationship you shouldn't be in right now, and you're saying that he's calling me to singleness. Don't waste the gift that he's trying to give you by envying another one. What does endurance look like for you? Last time I checked, the second most, in my opinion, the second most influential person in the entire New Testament, his name was Paul, was single. And he was single and like not ready to mingle. Like he was just single. He's like, this is me. I can do so much work for God because I'm single. Like I'm just embracing this thing. Endure. Endure. Don't settle. We have a need for endurance in our lives. And we'll talk about family and we'll talk about marriage. But every single one of us this morning, we have a long race ahead of us. You have a long race ahead of you. You have a long race ahead of you. And no matter how long the race or how difficult the journey, keep your eyes on Jesus. Choose Jesus because the cost of your obedience is nothing compared to the King on the other side of it. The cost of your obedience is nothing compared to the King on the other side of it. The cost for Jesus' obedience in verse 2 was joy. So you can endure through when you know who you are enduring to. Whatever you're facing, you can endure through it because you know who you are enduring to. And it's not purpose and it's not satisfaction. It's not a relationship. It is simply Jesus. He is enough and he is worth it. So endure. At this time, I want to pray for us. In fact, I want to invite you to stand up. The band's going to make their way on stage. Our prayer team's going to make their way out. This morning, here's the challenge and the encouragement is this. Whatever you are facing now, whatever you are going through, you have a way to endure because Jesus is here. And so my invitation this morning is to not settle, to not just give in to what you feel, but to simply ask, God, would you lead? And would you give me the courage and the boldness and the endurance to do exactly what you're calling me to? There is a cost to our obedience, but there is joy on the other side of it because there's Jesus.